As we have now passed the first anniversary of the PS5 and Xbox Series X, it's time to reflect and predict. Who will win, who will lose, and do we pit the Nintendo Switch against these two? As we draw random straws and I work on reflecting on Nintendo's year because I don't have any other consoles, let's take a look back on the console generations past and see who exactly won each war. I'll be looking at home consoles only, and I'll limit each company to one console per generation only. So, no Atari double dipping, no handhelds, and no pitting the Wii and Wii U against each other. Also, I'll only be looking at the main consoles in each generation, so only the ones people can really remember. I'm sorry, Atari Jaguar, if anyone bought you, maybe things would be different. Finally, I'll be giving out 2 winners' prizes. One for most sales, and one for cultural impact and critical reception. The first is more objective, obviously, but if you still disagree with it, blame Wikipedia, not me. So, who here knows what the first generation of home consoles is? If you said things like the Atari 2600, congrats! You're wrong. The first generation of consoles, according to Wikipedia, is dedicated to Pong consoles, like the Magnavox Odyssey. Yeah, I'm not confident picking a winner for this one. Apparently the Color TV game has sold the most of the generation, but I feel like that's more because it was technically Nintendo's first home console, so collectors are picking up more recently. Yeah, nobody's gonna begrudge me for not making a choice here. Here we go, the first console generation most people can name consoles from by memory. The main consoles from this time, at least based on statistics, were the ColecoVision, the Intellivision, and the Atari 2600, yeah that one. Atari basically kickstarted the modern idea of a video game console and became the first ever video game craze. Of course, in hindsight it was a Pyrrhic victory, a term which here means congrats on your win, here's more or less immediate bankruptcy and shutdown. I always find it funny how people talk about the video game crash as if it was this generation-defining thing that lasted for years. Like, sure, I guessed it lasted for years. 2 of them to be exact. The third generation of consoles, beginning in 1985, and let's get this out of the way now, the NES wins. Oh sure, they did technically have competition. Atari's Ashes tried to stage a comeback with the 7800, and the Sega Master System has technically never been discontinued in Brazil. But let's be real here. Nintendo owned this generation, even more than Atari did the last one. The NES redefined gaming for a generation, and it is still in the top 10 best-selling home consoles ever. It revolutionized how games were perceived, for better and for worse. How many franchises got their start here? Zelda, Metroid, Bomberman, Castlevania, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Mega Man, pretty much everything started either here or in the arcades. Yeah, people are pretty tired of NES nostalgia these days, but let's be honest here. There's a reason everyone remembers this console. However, before the NES was retired, Nintendo's first real competitor in the market truly started to rise up. The Sega Genesis, aka the Mega Drive if you swing that way. This was a serious change-up, basically reintroducing competition to the market for the first time in years. The Genesis was faster, higher bit, and could run games better than the NES ever could. Even when Nintendo brought out their entry for the generation, the Super NES, Sega still had the faster hardware, hence the coining of blast processing. However, the SNES did have higher RAM, which resulted in higher quality graphics and better audio. This was also when marketing started really igniting the console wars. See, these days we have some back and forth, passive-aggressive tweets, subtle digs at the competition. Back then, Sega said, "Fuck you, Nintendo, we're gonna kill your ass and place your corpse in a robot." It was brutal. And the games, oh my god, the games! This generation had some of the greatest games ever made, at least for their styles. Super Mario World, Super Metroid, A Link to the Past, all of the classic era of Sonic, Puyo Puyo, Streets of Rage, this was undoubtedly a golden age of video games. Hell, even a lot of the licensed games in this era became classics. So, how do you decide a winner? Well, looking at sales numbers, the SNES did come out on top, selling over 10 million more consoles than the Genesis. There are a lot of possible reasons for this, from the Genesis losing steam after the SNES came out, the numerous add-ons Sega tried to cram onto the Genesis, or Nintendo of America throwing them under the bus after politicians blamed Night Trap for all the crime ever committed.
This Sega Night Trap game was somehow only meant for adults. The fact of the matter is, this is a copy of the packaging. There was no rating on this game at all when the game was introduced. Small children bought this at Toys R Us, and he knows that as well as I do.
Culturally, I'm not sure there really is a definitive winner here. Most consoles are considered classics. Sega managed to pull millions of players away from an almost world power, but Nintendo just had more classic games in their library. Ultimately, if I have to give it to one specifically, which I might, I'd have to give it to the Sega Genesis. The first console to prove that gaming generations weren't just one console ruling over all. The leap from 2D to 3D. Gaming's never recovered. To really explain the 5th generation, I need to explain something that happened during the 4th. You see, about halfway through the generation, the cost of CD and DVD technology dropped enough that video game companies could conceivably print full games onto modern discs as opposed to the cartridges that consoles had used up to that point, or the floppy disks that PCs used to use. Sega jumped onto this trend with the Sega CD, infamously, and Nintendo did want to do something very similar. They partnered with a Japanese company known for innovating in recording and storage in the hopes of creating a disc-playing add-on for the SNES. However, the deal fell through after Nintendo realized the agreement would screw them out of a lot of money, and even ownership of several of their own games. Instead, they partnered with Philips, a Dutch company with a similar history, in hopes of a better deal. The result was 4 of the worst games in 2 Nintendo franchises, and Sony officially entering the console market in 1994 and never being able to leave. The PlayStation, commonly called the PS1 nowadays, was by far the most commercially successful console of the generation, and it's still in the top 5 consoles of all time. Over 100 million units sold, selling more than the SNES and Genesis combined. It held some historic games, was the true codifier of the CD as the gaming medium of choice, and on top of all of that, it could play music CDs too. This was the console to beat for this generation. Sega, meanwhile, promptly collapsed in on itself. The Sega Saturn, technically released before the PlayStation, although that fact is part of why it failed so spectacularly. It had decent games, it had decent specs, it just had zero presence on the market. It was released in North America months before it was supposed to, and only to select retailers, which immediately torpedoed Sega's relationship with pretty much every other retailer. Hell, the company behind Toys R Us fucking dropped Sega completely, and Toys R Us was one of the stores that got it! Definitely didn't help that Sega announced its price of $3.99 on stage, and then Sony did the biggest mic drop ever that same E3.
$2.99.
Yep. The Sega Saturn had about 0 good press, 0 effective marketing, and sold less than the Master System. It was a mess. Nintendo did better, if only because they actually had a console. The Nintendo 64, the last major console launch of the generation in 1996. The N64 had drawbacks, some very major ones too. It launched after PlayStation had established their dominance, it still used cartridges that couldn't hold as much data as CDs, barely any of the third parties even touched the console, and its controller, while functional, looked like it was built for aliens. However, the N64 did have one thing over the competition: 64-bit graphics and full 3D. The console launched with 2 games, Pilot Wings 64, a flight sim that showed off the fancy graphics the system was capable of, and Super Mario 64, one of the most influential games of the last 3 decades. There are a load of classic games for the N64, timeless titles: Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Mario Kart 64, the first 3 Mario Parties, fucking Rare! The problem was, outside of fucking Rare and maybe Hudson Soft, there just wasn't much support outside of Nintendo itself. There was some, but by the end of its life cycle, the N64 had less than 400 games in its library, less than 300 in North America, and less than 200 in Japan. Jesus. The PlayStation had almost 8,000 games in its library, including Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Gran Turismo, Tekken, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, Rayman, Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, Driver, Silent Hill, Tomb Raider, Dragon Quest 7, and the 27th best-selling game on the platform, Frogger 1997, aka Frogger, he's back! Yeah, I have a soft spot for the N64, as I imagine most Nintendo fans do, but it's easy to see why exactly Sony ended up winning the war in terms of sales. But what about culturally? Who had the better console in terms of impact? Well, definitely not the Saturn, first off. I'd say, as much as it has sort of fallen in terms of number of memorable games, a lot of the N64's library made up for lack of quantity by sheer quality. Sure, the PS1 had a lot of amazing games, but it also had 9 different Madden games, and also half the games Kid Icarus screamed about in his early years. I'm going to give the win to the N64 here, just for being slightly more consistent and having slightly better graphics. Though I can absolutely understand if there's disagreement on this one. The PS2. Okay, that's not really fair. The 6th generation had some major milestones. The last of the 3 current Titans entered the market, Nintendo finally started using DVDs sort of, Sega officially dropped dead. I always find it funny that the Dreamcast is seen as more of a success than the Saturn. It sold over 100,000 less units. To be fair, the Dreamcast was not a bad console. It was arguably more powerful than the PS2 in some ways. It was the first console to really push online gaming. Hell, it was the first console of the generation released, launching in Japan before the N64 had reached its 3rd birthday. The problem was, by this point, Sega just wasn't the powerhouse it used to be. It had burned a lot of bridges with the Saturn, and it burned even more with the development of the Dreamcast. EA refused to make games for the system, the launch pretty much everywhere except America was botched, and while Sega has pretty much always relied on America for its success, well, the PlayStation was still being sold, and a lot of America didn't really have any interest in Sega after everything that had happened the past 5 years. By the time the GameCube launched, Sega had announced they were leaving the console business to become a software developer exclusively. Man, it's weird how immediately they jumped into bed with Nintendo. Like, Super Monkey Ball launched on GameCube before the Dreamcast had even been dead for half a year. It's wild. The Nintendo GameCube. My first ever home console, though it was more my family's than mine, really. I have a lot of good memories with it, and it did sort of have more success than the N64, in terms of how many games there were, not sales. It tanked in sales. It is one of Nintendo's worst-selling consoles, second only to the 8th generation's favorite punching bag that we'll get to in a bit. It isn't that hard to see why, honestly. It was decently powerful, but its aesthetic was still very much in a kiddie toy section rather than the PS2's more advanced, sleek design. The discs were mini DVDs rather than full DVDs, presumably to make them harder to copy and jailbreak, but that made them harder to develop for and pretty small in terms of storage, at least compared to the competition. It had no backwards compatibility, which, while understandable, was kind of a drawback considering the PS2 could play most, if not all, PS1 games. Plus, unlike the PS2, which, might I add, launched a year before the GameCube did, the GameCube was just for playing video games. You can't play CDs, can't watch movies, can't even look at the start menu without what feels like an exploit. The GameCube was just for games, which makes sense given the name, I guess. It was a good console, and I do still love it, but, well, the world as a whole did not. Still, at least we got some great games out of it. The Xbox has a stupid name. It really feels like Microsoft said, oh, gaming is a big thing, we should probably get in on that so we can have even more all of the money in the world. It was a powerful console, it had some must-have games, but my god, it has no identity. That's kind of a running problem with Xbox, honestly. Nintendo has their centuries-old brand, even Sony has some personality with their PlayStations, but Microsoft just makes their consoles feel like generic game console in a movie. In fact, spoiler alert, even with their biggest success in the NES generation, Microsoft is the only of the three pillars to never come out on top in terms of sales. They outsold the GameCube, but then again, so did the Atari 2600. The only reason Xbox is still a thing is A, Halo redefined first-person shooters for a while, and 2, Microsoft has PC money, so they can afford a loss in the console market. As for the PS2, what do you want me to say? It was the PS2. It could play DVDs, over 90% of the PS1 library, had all of Sony's goodwill from the PS1, it had Spider-Man 2 and all the franchises introduced from the previous generation, and then some, arguably the most definitive versions of many multi-platform releases. All the third parties loved it. This thing sold more than there are people in Japan and only got discontinued in 2013 after a 13-year lifespan. Pretty much up until the PS4 launched. Yeah, I love the GameCube, but it's no contest. The PS2 wins. The 7th console generation, the one you need me the least for. There are already tons of videos going in depth on literally every aspect of this generation, from tech to marketing to whatever the fuck a Blu-ray is. I'll keep this section brief, but I highly recommend looking into this topic further for yourself. In short, the PS3 and Xbox 360 were both dedicated to HD visuals, with the PS3 getting off to a rocky start due to overly complex hardware and a far too high price point, while the 360 got an amazing head start despite half the consoles not fucking working. Both received redesigns addressing the main issues later on, with the PS3 eventually making a comeback and outselling the 360 once Microsoft started to rest on their laurels a bit too much and tried appealing to casual gamers. Overall, the Xbox 360 sold almost 85 million units, while the PS3 sold nearly 87.5 million units. Then the Wii sold 100 million. Looking back, there is so much to mock about the Wii. It was barely more powerful than the GameCube, its only real graphical improvement was being widescreen, Nintendo all but abandoned the hardcore market in favor of casual gaming, and that name is still really dumb. But ultimately, it didn't matter. The Wii revolutionized gaming with motion controls, and as it turns out, the casual market ate that shit up. They were fighting a completely different battle from Sony and Microsoft. Oh, sure, both got peripherals to compete with the Wii, but let's be real here. The PlayStation Move was a joke whose hardware only became relevant with the PS4 and PSVR, and the Kinect, while it had its uses, almost killed the Xbox division, always fun when the peripheral is nearly fatal. The Wii didn't succeed in spite of the flaws. It succeeded because of them. Also, it revolutionized physical therapy, and you could play GameCube games. Yeah, no wonder this sold like hotcakes. As for the cultural winner, it's difficult to say. I'd say for most people the Wii was the most impactful, but in terms of gaming culture and what the people who watch this video are most likely to care about, the 360 was way more iconic and a lot more influential. I'd consider it a toss-up between the two, but for this video, I'm gonna give that win to the Xbox. It will probably be the only one it gets. PS4 wins. Yeah, the 8th generation is defined by failure. The Xbox One had a poor reveal, a high starting price point, worse marketing than the PS4, a not-so-great lineup of exclusives, less power than the PS4, and by god, the worst name they could have possibly given it. My god, at least the Wii U didn't fuck up chronology, Microsoft. Who names their third console fucking one? Oh, and don't think I missed you, Nintendo. The Wii U, aka the closest Nintendo's come to death since the Virtual Boy, nearly blinded children. Worst selling home console Nintendo's ever had, ladies, gents, and comrades, selling worse than the 2600, the original Xbox, and barely a quarter of what the Xbox One sold. Oh look, we're going to make a console built entirely around a stupid fucking controller that barely anything is able to use, because it turns out looking between a fucking Playmobil screen and a HD TV isn't very good for hardcore gaming, but we're barely even going to touch the casual market despite it being the only reason we sold like fucking water with our last console. The only console that made it out of this generation with an even okay reputation was the PS4. Sure, the Xbox One gained some traction back when Microsoft backpedaled on a few contentious points, and the revisions did help it, but honestly, I don't even have the energy to argue this. The PS4 wins, end of discussion. Let me soak in depression. So that brings us to today. Sony and Microsoft both brought out their 9th generation consoles in November 2020. Both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and S prioritize ultra-high-def resolutions from 4K to 8K, as well as higher frame rates and more options. The PS5 definitely got the early start, having already all but certainly outsold the Wii U, while the Xbox consoles have sold less than the Dreamcast, but it's too early to truly declare a winner. Will Sony gain their 4th crown and reign supreme over yet another console generation? Will the Xbox finally sell the most of the generation for the first time ever? And perhaps the most crucial question of all, do we count the Nintendo Switch in a generation? Because if we do, holy shit, I think this is the winner. The Nintendo Switch, better known as Nintendo's Make It or Break It Hail Mary, Wikipedia lists it as an 8th generation console, and in that race it took 2nd place to the PS4, but for my money, it really isn't in that race. Nintendo released it 3 years after the PS4 and Xbox One, but 3 years before the PS5 and Xbox Series X. Personally, I see it as an early entry in the 9th generation, and in that race, holy shit, it's doing well. If you consider it a home console, it's the 2nd best selling console Nintendo's ever made, and given it is the holiday season and the recent edition released not long ago, that number might have already surpassed the Wii. If you consider it a handheld, it's already surpassed the Game Boy Advance and the 3DS lines, though that does leave it behind the original Game Boy and the DS. And however you consider it, it is legitimately Nintendo's saving grace after the failure of the Wii U and the early lows of the 3DS. Not everything about it is amazing, the Joy-Cons have issues, and the online services range from overdone but not terrible value to you're turning me $80 for an N64 games that don't work. But the Switch is still an amazing package, especially with just how many games this thing can play. Honestly, unless Nintendo brings out a next console in the next 2 or 3 years, or the PS5 suddenly becomes $500 cheaper, I think the Switch is going to claim the win for this generation. What do you think? Do you think Xbox got a bad deal in this video? Do you think the Dreamcast was a deserving death for Sega? Do you think the fact I've only ever had Nintendo consoles and PC swayed my decision making? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.